Hey everyone, welcome back to the Story Vault. Today's mystery is titled The Seaside Pavilion Tragedy. A Miss Marple mystery. A peaceful seaside afternoon takes a dark turn when tragedy strikes, and Miss Marple must uncover the truth hidden beneath the waves. So grab a cup of tea, settle in, and let's dive into this gripping tale. And if you enjoy these classic mysteries, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the Story Vault grow. Chapter 1. Striped deck chairs and a brass overture. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the newly painted boards of the Whitstable Seaside Pavilion, its fresh coat of cream and blue gleaming like a maritime jewel against the peter sky. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her spectacles and settled more comfortably into her striped deck chair, the canvas creaking softly beneath her slight frame. The sea breeze carried the mingled scents of salt spray and the bunting that fluttered gay from every available post and railing. "How very festive it all looks, Dolly," she remarked to her companion, Mrs. Bantry, who was fanning herself with the evening's program. "One can quite feel the excitement in the air." Mrs. Bantry nodded enthusiastically, her feathered hat bobbing with the movement. "Oh, Jane, I'm so pleased you agreed to come down for the reopening. The whole town has been talking of nothing else for weeks. To think that dear old pavilion was nearly torn down for a bingo hall. The very idea." Miss Marple's keen blue eyes swept across the open-sided structure that jutted out over the water on its weathered wooden piles. The pavilion had indeed been transformed from the derelict ruin she remembered from her last visit to Whitstable. Fresh timber gleamed where rotted boards had been replaced, and new electric lanterns hung in festive clusters above the stage. The setting sun caught the brass instruments of the assembled orchestra, creating pools of golden light that danced across the sheet music stands. "The acoustics should be quite remarkable," Miss Marple observed, noting how the sound of conversation seemed to carry and blend with the gentle lapping of waves beneath the structure. "Though I do hope the evening holds fair. Those clouds on the horizon look rather ominous." At the conductor's podium, a small, dark man with expressive hands was speaking rapidly in accented English to a heritable-looking gentleman in a morning coat. Even from her front-row seat, Miss Marple could detect the tension in their voices, though the words were lost in the general hubbub of the gathering crowd. "That's Maestro Montini," Mrs. Bantry whispered conspiratorially. "The Italian conductor they've brought in especially for tonight. Frightfully temperamental by all accounts. And that's Mr. Drummond beside him, the impresario, who's taken on the pavilion. Rather brave of him, considering the enormous loan he's had to secure." Miss Marple studied the two men with interest. Maestro Carlo Montini was indeed a striking figure. His silver hair swept dramatically back from a high forehead, his dark eyes flashing as he gestured toward the orchestra. Mr. Cedric Drummond, by contrast, appeared the very picture of English respectability, though there was something in his manner that suggested considerable anxiety beneath the composed exterior. "He seems rather overwrought, the maestro," Miss Marple murmured. "Oh, you should have heard him this afternoon during rehearsal," said a pleasant voice behind them. Miss Marple turned to see a young woman with orb and hair tucked neatly beneath a modest clock hat. She carried a cello case and wore the serious expression of a dedicated musician. "I do beg your pardon," the young woman continued, coloring slightly. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Betty Forsett. I'm playing with the orchestra tonight." "How exciting for you, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "Your first professional engagement?" "Oh, goodness, no," Betty replied with a laugh, "though it is rather special for me. You see, my grandfather built this pavilion originally back in 1898. My family owned it until just after the war when we had to sell. I never dreamed I'd be performing here again." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with interest. "How wonderful that you should be part of its resurrection. Though I imagine it must be rather bittersweet." Betty's expression grew thoughtful. "In a way, yes, though I'm grateful it's been saved. Mr. Hatha certainly had very different plans for the site." "Hatherley?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Giles Hatha, the concert agent. He's been trying to buy the pavilion for months, wanting to tear it down for some sort of amusement arcade. Frightfully modern, all flashing lights and mechanical noise. He was quite put out when Mr. Drummond secured the lease instead." Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a figure near the back of the pavilion, a tall man in an expensive suit, who seemed to be surveying the proceedings with considerable displeasure. His narrow, aristocratic features were set in lines of barely concealed irritation as he spoke to a small group of local dignitaries. "I believe that must be Mr. Hatherley now," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry. "Indeed it is," Betty confirmed, following her gaze. "He's still hoping Mr. Drummond will fail, I'm afraid. Some people simply cannot bear to see others succeed where they have not." A sharp crack from the public address system drew their attention back to the stage, where a capable-looking woman in navy trousers was adjusting one of the microphones. Her movements had the precise efficiency of someone accustomed to technical work, and Miss Marple noticed the small anchor tattoo on her wrist as she reached up to test the equipment. "That's Elsa Pym, our stage electrician," Betty explained. "Marvelous with anything electrical. She served in the Navy during the war, working with radio equipment. Mr. Drum and was terribly lucky to find someone with her skills willing to work for what he could afford to pay." Miss Marple watched with interest as Elsa Pym moved between the various electrical connections with practiced ease. The woman's face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent considerable time at sea, and there was something in her manner that suggested a certain guardedness, as though she were perpetually assessing potential threats. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Drummond's voice suddenly rang out over the public address system, causing a general stirring among the assembled audience. "If you would please take your seats, we shall begin this evening's gala performance in just a few moments." As the crowd settled into expectant silence, Miss Marple found her attention caught by something that seemed oddly out of place. Behind the brass section, partially hidden by music stands and the controlled chaos of an orchestra preparing to perform, a length of copper earthing cable lay coiled in an untidy heap. It struck her as peculiar that such an obviously safety-conscious electrician as Miss Pye would leave any equipment in such a careless state. The evening breeze freshened, carrying with it the salt tang of the rising tide and the distant cry of seagulls wheeling over the darkening water. Miss Marple pulled her light shawl more closely about her shoulders and settled back to enjoy what promised to be a memorable evening of music by the sea. Maestro Montini raised his silver baton, and expectant hush fell over the pavilion as the sun began its final descent toward the horizon. Chapter 2. The Maestro's Final Downbeat. The first half of the concert had proceeded without incident, the strains of Elgar and Vaughan Williams floating out over the darkening waters of the Thames Estuary. Miss Marple had found herself genuinely moved by the quality of the performance, particularly young Betty Fawcett's sensitive cello work during the Enigma variations. The pavilion's acoustics were indeed remarkable, as she had predicted, the open structure allowing the music to blend harmoniously with the natural sounds of wind and wave. During the interval, she had taken a brief stroll along the boardwalk with Mrs. Bantry, noting with some concern the gathering storm clouds on the horizon. The wind had picked up considerably, causing the bunting to snap and flutter with increasing violence, and she had been grateful to return to the relative shelter of her deck chair as the second half commenced. Now, As the sun touched the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold, Maestro Montini stepped once more to his podium. The closing piece was to be a rousing rendition of Rule Britannia, chosen, no doubt, as a patriotic flourish to mark the pavilion's triumphant return to life. The audience stirred with anticipation, and Miss Marple noticed several gentlemen removing their hats in preparation for what would undoubtedly be a spirited sing-along. The maestro's silver baton caught the last rays of sunlight as he raised it high above his head. His dark eyes swept across the orchestra with a commanding presence that had made him famous throughout Europe. For a moment, he held the pose, building the tension, and then brought his arm down in a decisive, dramatic gesture. The amplified sound of the downbeat cracked through the evening air like a gunshot, and Miss Marple saw several members of the audience start in their seats. But almost immediately, something went terribly wrong. A brilliant blue flash arced from the metal music stand before the conductor, and Maestro Montini's body went rigid, his baton frozen in mid-air. For what seemed an eternity, but could only have been seconds, he stood thus, his face contorted in an expression of shock and pain. Then, as if in slow motion, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the wooden floor of the stage with a sickening thud. The orchestra faltered to a discordant halt, several musicians leaping to their feet in alarm. Screams echoed from the audience, and chairs scraped against the boards as people surged forward to see what had happened. Miss Marple found herself on her feet, along with everyone else, her heart pounding with the shock of what she had witnessed. "Stand back! Stand back, I say!" The commanding voice belonged to Dr. Hawk, who was pushing his way through the crowd toward the stage. Miss Marple was not entirely surprised to see the familiar figure of St. Mary's medical practitioner. She recalled Mrs. Bantry mentioning that he was holidaying somewhere along the coast. The doctor vaulted onto the stage with surprising agility for a man of his years and knelt beside the fallen conductor. Miss Marple watched his face intently as he conducted his examination, noting the way his expression grew increasingly grave as the seconds ticked by. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," Dr. Haydock announced finally, rising to his feet and addressing the hushed crowd. "The gentleman has suffered a massive cardiac arrest. Death would have been instantaneous." A collective gasp arose from the audience, followed by the nervous murmur of shocked voices. Miss Marple observed how quickly the festive atmosphere had transformed into something altogether more sinister. The colorful bunting now seemed garish in the gathering dusk, and the cheerful electric lanterns cast harsh shadows across faces that had moments before been wrecked. The gruff voice belonged to Inspector Slack of the local constabulary, who had materialized with remarkable speed given the remote location of the pavilion. "Can't say I'm entirely surprised. These continental types, always getting themselves worked up about nothing. Temperamental. That's what they are." Miss Marple frowned slightly at this casual dismissal. While she was well aware of Inspector Slack's tendency toward hasty conclusions, she found herself troubled by certain aspects of what she had witnessed. The brilliant flash from the music stand, for instance, seemed inconsistent with a simple cardiac episode. "If I might suggest, Inspector," Dr. Haydock interjected diplomatically, "it would be prudent to have the body examined more thoroughly. While cardiac arrest is certainly the immediate cause of death, there may be contributing factors that warrant investigation." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he found this medical caution somewhat excessive, but he nodded grudgingly. "Very well, Doctor, though I can't see what there is to investigate." Man's heart gave out, pure and simple, probably the excitement of conducting in front of all these people. As the grim business of removing the body commenced, Miss Marple found herself drawn toward the stage. The crowd was beginning to disperse, many people clearly eager to escape the scene of such an unpleasant incident. But she felt compelled to observe more closely the spot where the tragedy had occurred. The metal music stand still gleamed under the electric lights, showing no obvious signs of damage. The sheet music for Rule Britannia lay scattered where it had fallen, and the silver baton rested on the boards a few feet from where Maestro Montini had collapsed. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Yet Miss Marple's instincts told her that all was not as it seemed. Bending down with the pretense of retrieving her dropped program, she drew closer to the conductor's podium. As she did so, a faint but distinctive odor reached her nostrils, the sharp, clean scent of ozone that follows a lightning strike. It was subtle, almost masked by the salt air and the mingled perfumes of the departing audience, but unmistakable to anyone who had experienced a severe thunderstorm. More intriguing still was what she observed near the spot where the maestro had fallen. His patent leather shoes, polished to a mirror finish for the evening's performance, bore faint scorch marks along the edges of the soles. They were barely visible unless one knew what to look for. But, to Miss Marple's experienced eye, they told a story quite different from the simple cardiac arrest that Inspector Slack was so ready to accept. "Tragic business, absolutely tragic," Mr. Drummond was saying to a small group of local dignitaries. His face was pale and drawn, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. The poor maestro seemed perfectly well during rehearsal. I cannot imagine what could have brought on such a sudden attack. "Excitement, most likely," replied one of the gentlemen, a portly individual who Miss Marple recognized as the town's mayor. "These artistic types often have weak constitutions. All that emotional intensity takes its toll." Miss Marple found herself studying the faces around her with particular interest. Betty Fawcett stood near her cello, her face a mask of shock and distress. Elsa Pym was methodically disconnecting the electrical equipment, her movements efficient and professional despite the circumstances. Giles Hayther remained at the back of the pavilion, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting a man who was perhaps not entirely displeased by the evening's turn of events. As the crowd continued to thin, Miss Marple made her way quietly to where Mrs. Bantry stood in conversation with several other ladies. "Such a dreadful shock, Jane," her friend murmured. "To think that poor man should die so suddenly, and on what should have been such a triumphant evening." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, her eyes still scanning the scene before them, "though I cannot help but wonder whether the evening's events were quite as straightforward as they appear." Mrs. Bantry looked at her sharply. "Whatever do you mean?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and gazed thoughtfully at the now silent stage. "Perhaps nothing at all, dear, but I have learned over the years that when something seems too simple, it very often proves to be far more complicated than one might initially suppose." The first drops of rain began to fall as the last of the audience made their way along the boardwalk toward the shore, bringing the ill-fated reopening of the Whitstable Seaside Pavilion to its melancholy close. Chapter 3. Miss Marple finds sand in a violin case. The morning after the tragedy dawned gray and overcast, with intermittent showers that drummed against the windows of the Seahorse Inn, where Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry had taken rooms for their seaside holiday. The cheerful bunting that had decorated the pavilion the previous evening now hung limp and bedraggled in the persistent drizzle, a melancholy reminder of how quickly celebration could turn to sorrow. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and after a solitary breakfast in the inn's small dining room, she found herself drawn back toward the scene of the previous evening's events. The pavilion stood silent and deserted in the morning light, its bright paint looking somehow less festive under the leaden sky. Yellow police tape fluttered across the entrance, though she noted that no constable had been posted to guard the scene. She was not entirely surprised to encounter Betty Fawcett making her way along the boardwalk, carrying her cello case with obvious difficulty. The young woman's face was pale and drawn, suggesting she had slept as poorly as Miss Marple herself. "Miss Marple," Betty called out, setting down her case to wave. "I didn't expect to see anyone else about so early." "I find that a morning walk often helps to clear one's thoughts after a distressing experience," Miss Marple replied kindly, approaching the young musician. "I trust you are feeling somewhat better today." Betty's smile was won. "Not really, I'm afraid. I keep thinking about poor Maestro Montini, such a vital man, so full of passion for his music. It seems impossible that he should be gone so suddenly." "Indeed. You were packing away your instrument when it happened, I believe?" "Yes, we had just finished the first half of the program. I always pack my cello away during intervals to protect it from the sea air." Betty paused, her brow creasing with puzzlement, though I must say the strangest thing has happened this morning. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Oh, well, when I opened my case to check that everything was secure before bringing it back to my lodgings, I found the most peculiar thing." Betty set down the case and opened it carefully, revealing the gleaming instrument nestled in its blue velvet lining. "Look here, Miss Marple. Sand. Quite a lot of it, actually." Miss Marple bent forward to examine the interior of the case more closely. Indeed, there was a fine sprinkling of sand scattered across the velvet, particularly concentrated around the scroll end of the cello. What struck her immediately was the unusual color, not the golden sand one typically found on the beaches of Kent, but a much darker, almost black variety. "How very odd," she murmured, taking out her small magnifying glass for a closer inspection. "Are you quite certain the case was closed during the performance?" "Absolutely certain," Betty replied firmly. "I'm extremely careful about that. The salt air can be terribly damaging to the varnish, and this is a rather valuable instrument. I inherited it from my grandfather." "The same grandfather who built the pavilion?" "Yes, indeed. He was quite accomplished musically, though he made his fortune in shipping." Betty's expression grew more puzzled as she stared at the sand. "I simply cannot understand how this could have happened. I practiced on the pier earlier in the day, but I'm quite certain my case never touched the ground." Miss Marple carefully extracted a small sample of the sand with her fingernail, examining it closely through her magnifying glass. The grains were indeed remarkably dark, with an almost metallic sheen that was quite unlike ordinary beach sand. "Might I take a small sample to examine more closely?" she asked politely. "Of course, though I can't imagine what you hope to discover." Betty watched as Miss Marple carefully wrapped a few grains in her handkerchief. "Do you think it might be important somehow? In my experience, my dear, it is often the smallest and most seemingly insignificant details that prove to be the most revealing." Miss Marple straightened up, her keen eyes taking in the various structures along the waterfront. "Tell me, where exactly did you practice yesterday?" Betty pointed toward the end of the pier where a small shelter provided protection from the wind, just there in the bandstand. "I find the acoustics quite good for practice, and it's usually quiet during the day." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The distance from the pier to the pavilion was considerable, and she could see no obvious way that sand from one location could have found its way into a closed instrument case at the other. More intriguingly, the sand on the pier appeared to be the normal golden variety, quite different from the dark specimen she had observed in Betty's case. "I don't suppose you recall seeing anyone near your case during the evening?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Betty considered this carefully. Well, naturally, there were people moving about during the interval, members of the orchestra, of course, and Mr. Drummond was on the stage several times, checking various arrangements. Miss Pym was adjusting the electrical equipment. She paused, frowning slightly. Come to think of it, I did notice someone crouched down near where the instruments were stored, but I assumed it was one of the musicians making an adjustment. Someone you didn't recognize? I'm afraid I didn't get a clear look. It was during the interval, and there was quite a lot of activity. People were moving about, refreshments were being served. I thought nothing of it at the time. Miss Marple made a mental note of this information while continuing to study the peculiar sand. Its dark, almost coal-like appearance suggested it was not naturally occurring beach material, but rather something that had been processed or contaminated in some way. I wonder, she mused aloud, whether you might show me exactly where you practiced yesterday. I find I'm rather curious about the different types of sand one encounters along this stretch of coast. Betty looked somewhat puzzled by this request, but agreed readily enough. As they made their way toward the pier, Miss Marple found herself studying the various structures that dotted the waterfront. The pavilion, perched on its wooden piles above the high tide mark, was the most prominent, but there were also several smaller buildings. A refreshment kiosk, a fisherman's hut, and what appeared to be a small workshop or storage facility. The pier itself was a modest affair, extending perhaps 50 yards into the estuary. The bandstand where Betty had practiced was indeed well positioned for acoustics, with curved walls that would reflect and focus the sound. The sand here was the expected golden color, fine and clean, bearing no resemblance to the dark material they had found in the cello case. Most curious, Miss Marple murmured, kneeling to examine the pier's construction more closely. The wooden planking was old, but well maintained, and she could see no obvious source for the unusual sand. And it was as they were making their way back toward the inn that Miss Marple's attention was caught by something she had not noticed during her earlier examination of the waterfront. Beneath the pavilion itself, where the wooden piles disappeared into the water at high tide, there was a distinct discoloration of the sand and shingle. The material here was indeed much darker than elsewhere, with the same metallic sheen she had observed in Betty's case. Coal, slag, sand, she murmured to herself, recognizing it now. It was a byproduct of industrial processes, often used as fill material in coastal construction projects. The pavilion's piles would have been driven deep into such material when the structure was originally built, and the constant action of tides and weather would have brought it to the surface in the immediate vicinity. "I beg your pardon," Betty asked, following Miss Marple's gaze toward the pavilion's foundations. "Oh, nothing of great importance, my dear. Merely observing the different geological formations one encounters along the shore." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, but her mind was working rapidly. The presence of cold slag sand in Betty's closed cello case could only mean one thing. At some point during the previous evening, either the case itself or someone who had handled it had been in direct contact with the area beneath the pavilion piles. Given Betty's certainty that her case had remained closed and untouched throughout the performance, this suggested that someone else had been crawling about in that confined and rather unpleasant space during the course of the evening. The question was who, and more importantly, why? As they walked back toward the inn, Miss Marple found herself recalling the coiled copper earthing cable she had noticed behind the brass section the previous evening. Could there be some connection between that oddly placed piece of equipment and the mysterious sand that had found its way into Betty's case? The rain began to fall more heavily, and Miss Marple pulled her mackintosh more closely about her as she pondered this latest development in what was proving to be a most intriguing puzzle. Chapter 4. 3 microphones, but one hums blue. By mid-afternoon the rain had ceased, and watery sunlight was struggling through the dispersing clouds. Miss Marple had spent the morning hours in quiet contemplation, seated in the inn's comfortable lounge with her knitting. But her thoughts had been far from the simple pattern of the cardigan she was creating for her great-nephew. The peculiar sand in Betty Fawcett's case continued to trouble her, and she found herself increasingly convinced that Maestro Montini's death had been far from natural. It was therefore with considerable interest that she observed Inspector Slack making his way along the seafront, accompanied by what appeared to be an official photographer. The inspector's expression suggested a man going through the motions rather than conducting a thorough investigation. But Miss Marple was pleased to see that some attempt was being made to document the scene properly. More intriguing still was the sight of Elsa Pym emerging from the pavilion carrying what appeared to be a toolkit. The stage electrician moved with her characteristic efficiency, but Miss Marple noticed a certain tension in her posture that had not been evident the previous evening. Donning her light coat and taking up her handbag, Miss Marple made her way back toward the pavilion. She found Miss Pym standing before a complex array of electrical equipment that had been set up on a folding table near the entrance to the structure. "Good afternoon, Miss Pym," she said pleasantly. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Elsa looked up from her work, her weathered face breaking into what might have been a smile. "Not at all, Mom. Just running some tests on the sound equipment. Inspector Slack wants to be certain there wasn't any electrical fault that might have contributed to the maestro's collapse." "How very thorough of him," Miss Marple observed, "though I confess I know very little about such technical matters. The equipment looks terribly complicated." "Oh, it's not so bad once you understand the principles," Elsa replied, her obvious pride in her expertise overcoming her natural reticence. "The public address system is really quite straightforward. 3 ribbon microphones feeding into amplifiers, then out to the speakers. Simple enough in theory, though the seaside environment does present certain challenges." Miss Marple moved closer to examine the equipment with apparent fascination. "3 microphones, you say? How interesting. Are they all identical?" "Essentially, yes. Same make and model, same specifications. We positioned them to cover different sections of the orchestra." Elsa indicated 3 microphones that sat on the table before her, though I must say, one of them has been giving me some trouble this afternoon. "Oh dear, what sort of trouble?" Elsa picked up the middle microphone and connected it to her testing apparatus. Immediately, a low electrical hum emanated from the speakers, accompanied by an intermittent blue spark that danced across the microphone's grill. "That sort of trouble," she said grimly. "It's been acting up all day. Strange thing is, it worked perfectly well during yesterday's performance." Miss Marple studied the problematic microphone with interest. "And this was the one positioned near Maestro Montini's podium." "That's right, center stage to pick up the conductor's cues and any announcements." Elsa frowned as another blue spark crackled across the microphone surface. "I've never seen anything quite like it. The electrical characteristics seem completely wrong. Might I ask what could cause such a phenomenon?" Elsa set the microphone down carefully, her expression troubled. "Well, the most likely explanation would be damage to the internal components, or the housing. Water damage, perhaps, or physical impact of some kind." Miss Marple leaned closer, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the microphone's construction. The metal housing appeared intact, but she noticed that the rubber shield around the connection point showed signs of recent disturbance. The material looked fresh and pliable, quite different from the weathered appearance of the other components. "The rubber covering looks rather new," she observed mildly. "Good eye," Elsa admitted with what might have been grudging respect. "I had to replace part of the shield yesterday afternoon. Found it had been slit somehow, probably by accident during setup." Couldn't risk any moisture getting into the connection, so I patched it with fresh tape. How very professional of you, though I imagine such repairs must be done quite carefully. Oh yes, absolutely. Any exposed wiring in this environment could be extremely dangerous. Salt air is terribly corrosive, and with all the electrical current running through these systems, Elsa shuddered slightly. Well, let's just say I take no chances with safety. Miss Marple nodded understandingly, though her attention was caught by something else. The cloth windscreen that covered the microphone's grill appeared to be slightly damp, with what looked like water droplets clinging to its surface. This seemed odd, given that the equipment had presumably been stored in a dry location overnight. I noticed the windscreen seems rather moist, she commented innocently. Elsa glanced at the microphone with obvious irritation. Condensation, most likely. These seaside mornings can be quite humid, and the metal components tend to collect moisture, though I must say it does seem rather excessive. She removed the windscreen and held it up to the light, frowning as she did so. The fabric was indeed saturated with moisture, and as Miss Marple watched, several droplets fell onto the table below. "Most peculiar," Elsa muttered. "This is far more than simple condensation would account for." Miss Marple observed the droplets with interest. They had a slightly cloudy appearance and left faint mineral deposits on the table surface as they evaporated. Characteristics that suggested not ordinary rainwater, but seawater that had been concentrated through partial evaporation. I don't suppose you recall whether this particular microphone was positioned differently from the others yesterday evening? Miss Marple inquired casually. Elsa considered this question carefully. Not that I remember. All three were set up in their standard positions well before the performance began, though. ... She paused, her brow furrowing with concentration. Now that you mention it, Mr. Drummond did ask me to make some adjustments to the center microphone just before the second half began. Something about improving the pickup for the conductor's announcements. What sort of adjustments? Oh, nothing major. Just repositioning it slightly and checking the connections, though I do remember being rather surprised that he was concerned about such technical details at that particular moment. He seemed quite agitated about something. Miss Marple made a mental note of this information while continuing to study the troublesome microphone. The blue sparking was becoming more pronounced, and she could detect a faint odor that reminded her unpleasantly of the ozone scent she had noticed near Maestro Montini's fallen body. "Miss Pye," she said carefully, "in your professional opinion, could a microphone in this condition pose any danger to someone using it?" Elsa's expression grew grave as she considered the question. Well, under normal circumstances, the current levels in these systems are quite low. But if there was some sort of fault in the grounding system, or if moisture had compromised the insulation, she trailed off, staring at the sparking microphone with obvious concern. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Elsa said slowly, "that someone could have received a very nasty shock if they had come into contact with this microphone while it was in its current state, particularly if they were also touching something metal, like a music stand or a conductor's baton." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze, and such a shock could prove fatal to someone with a weak heart, or to someone with a perfectly healthy heart, if the circumstances were right, Elsa replied grimly. Electrical accidents can be deceptively dangerous, particularly in humid conditions. As if to emphasize her point, the microphone emitted another brilliant blue spark, this one accompanied by a sharp crackling sound that made both women step back involuntarily. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Inspector Slack should be informed of your findings as soon as possible." Elsa nodded, her weathered face pale with the implications of what they had discovered. "I'll disconnect this equipment immediately if there's been some sort of systematic failure in the electrical system, or," Miss Marple added softly, watching the other woman's reaction carefully, "if someone has deliberately tampered with it." The suggestion hung in the air between them like the lingering ozone scent from the sparking microphone, charged with possibilities that neither woman wished to contemplate. Chapter 5. Footprints Across the Boardwalk. The revelation about the faulty microphone had cast a decidedly sinister shadow over what Inspector Slack had been prepared to dismiss as a natural death. Miss Marple was pleased to observe that even that worthy gentleman's habitual skepticism had been somewhat shaken by Elsa Pym's technical demonstration, though his subsequent investigation seemed to her rather perfunctory. It was while returning from her second visit to the pavilion that afternoon that Miss Marple made her next significant discovery. The morning's rain had given way to intermittent showers, and the recently repaired sections of the boardwalk gleamed wetly under the pale sunlight. The local council had evidently been quite thorough in their renovations, she noted, with fresh planking and generous applications of tar to protect the wood from the harsh marine environment. She was picking her way carefully across one such freshly tread section when something caught her eye. The dark, viscous surface had preserved what appeared to be footprints with remarkable clarity, like ancient tracks preserved in amber. Most were the confused impressions of the previous evening's audience, overlapping and indistinct, but two sets stood out with startling clarity. Miss Marple paused, ostensibly to adjust a handbag, and studied the impressions more closely. The first set was easily recognizable: broad, heavy prints left by what appeared to be substantial brogues. The depth of the impression suggested a man of considerable weight, and the pattern of the sole was distinctly formal, the sort of footwear one might expect from a gentleman in evening dress. The second set was quite different. Narrow, elegant shoes with a distinctive pattern cut into the sole. As Miss Marple bent closer, she could make out what appeared to be small, decorative shapes pressed into the rubber. With a start of recognition, she realized they were stylized seagulls, the sort of whimsical touch one might find on expensive yachting shoes. What made these particular tracks so intriguing was their direction and relationship to one another. Both sets led from the main boardwalk toward a small building she'd not previously noticed. A modest structure tucked beneath the landwood end of the pavilion that appeared to house some sort of electrical or mechanical equipment. The brass nameplate beside the door read, "Switch Room, Authorized Personnel Only." More fascinating still was what the tracks revealed about the movements of their makers. Both sets of prints led clearly toward the switch room, the broad brogues and the narrow yachting shoes side by side, suggesting that two men had walked there together. But only one set, the broad brogues, returned along the same path. Miss Marple stood contemplating this curious circumstance when she became aware of voices approaching along the boardwalk, recognizing the tones of Inspector Slack and Sergeant Lake. She moved discreetly to one side, positioning herself where she could observe without appearing to eavesdrop. "Don't see why we need to bother with all this technical nonsense," Inspector Slack was saying irritably. "Man had a weak heart, got excited conducting his music, and keeled over. Happens all the time with these autistic types." "But what about the electrical fault Miss Pym discovered, sir?" Sergeant Lake ventured respectfully. "Surely that suggests there might be more to investigate." "Coincidence, most likely. Old equipment, seaside conditions, bound to be problems with the wiring. That doesn't mean anyone was murdered." Miss Marple listened to this exchange with some frustration. While she appreciated the sergeant's conscientiousness, it was clear that Inspector Slack remained reluctant to consider the possibility of foul play. Perhaps, she reflected, A gentle nudge in the right direction might prove helpful. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she called out pleasantly, emerging from her place of concealment. "I do hope your investigation is proceeding satisfactorily." Inspector Slack's expression suggested that few things could be less satisfactory than the unexpected appearance of Miss Marple at a potential crime scene. "Ah, Miss Marple, I might have known. Well, I suppose there's no harm in telling you that we found nothing to suggest anything other than natural causes." "How reassuring," Miss Marple replied mildly, though I couldn't help but notice these rather interesting footprints in the fresh tar. They seemed to tell quite a story. Despite his obvious reluctance, Inspector Slack found himself drawn to examine the impressions Miss Marple indicated. Sergeant Lake, she was pleased to note, showed considerably more interest and knelt down to study the tracks more carefully. "Two different men, I'd say," the sergeant observed, both heading toward that switch room building, but only one set coming back. "Probably nothing significant," Inspector Slack muttered, though his tone suggested he was beginning to have doubts about his initial assessment. Someone might have used a different route for their return journey. Miss Marple nodded agreeably. "Of course, that's entirely possible, though I couldn't help but notice that the switch room appears to have only one entrance, and the building is surrounded by rather thick shrubbery on three sides. It would be quite difficult to leave by any route other than the one used to enter." Sergeant Lake was now examining the footprints with obvious professional interest. "The broad ones look like formal dress shoes, sir. Evening wear, I'd say. And these narrow ones." He paused, studying the distinctive sole pattern. "Those are yachting shoes, or I'm much mistaken. Expensive ones, too, by the look of them." "Yachting shoes?" Inspector Slack's skepticism was beginning to give way to genuine curiosity. Who around here would be wearing yachting shoes to a concert? Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "I believe Mr. Giles Hatherley is rather fond of sailing. I noticed him wearing nautical-themed footwear at yesterday evening's performance." "Hatherley?" The inspector's interest was now fully engaged. "The fellow who wanted to buy the pavilion site." "The very same. And, if I'm not mistaken, those broader impressions might well belong to Mr. Drummond. He was wearing formal evening dress last night, and the size would certainly be consistent." Inspector Slack studied the footprints with renewed attention, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "You're suggesting that Drummond and Hather visited the switch room together during the performance?" "I'm merely observing what the evidence appears to suggest," Miss Marple replied diplomatically, "though it does seem curious that only one of them returned by the same route." Sergeant Lake had produced a measuring tape and was carefully documenting the impressions. "Should we speak to both gentlemen, sir? Ask them about their movements during the evening." "I suppose it wouldn't hurt," Inspector Slack admitted grudgingly, "though I still say we're making mountains out of molehills." Miss Marple watched with satisfaction as the two policemen made their way toward the switch room, clearly intent on a more thorough examination of the building and its surroundings. She had planted the seed of suspicion, and now it was up to them to nurture it into a proper investigation. The afternoon was growing late, and storm clouds were once again gathering on the horizon. Miss Marple made her way back toward the inn, her mind busy with the various pieces of the puzzle that were slowly beginning to emerge. The faulty microphone, the mysterious sand, and now these revealing footprints, each clue, seemed to point toward a conclusion that was both more complex and more sinister than anyone had initially suspected. Chapter 6. A light bulb missing from the Siebzi lantern. The following morning brought clearer skies and a fresh breeze that set the pavilion's remaining bunting dancing cheerfully in the sunlight. Miss Marple had breakfasted early and was making her customary morning circuit of the waterfront when she encountered Inspector Slack, emerging from the pavilion looking considerably more thoughtful than she had seen him in recent memory. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, touching his hat with what might almost have been respect. "I must say, your observations yesterday proved rather more significant than I initially supposed it. Indeed, Inspector, how gratifying." "Yes, well," he cleared his throat somewhat awkwardly. "That switch room you directed us to, most interesting place. Seems someone had been doing quite a bit of electrical work in there recently. Fresh wire splices, new connections, that sort of thing." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles with interest. "How very curious. I don't suppose Miss Pym mentioned any recent modifications to the electrical system?" "That's just it. She claims to know nothing about any new work. Says the system was completely checked and certified just last week, and no additional modifications were authorized." Inspector Slack's expression grew more serious, which raises the question of who was tinkering with the wiring and why. A most pertinent question indeed. I don't suppose Mr. Drummond or Mr. Hatherley were able to shed any light on their visit to the switch room. Inspector Slack's laugh was devoid of humor. "Ah, now there's where it gets interesting. Drummond admits to going there during the interval, claims he was checking on some technical matter at Hatherley's suggestion, but Hather denies being anywhere near the place. Says he spent the entire interval in conversation with the mayor and several other local dignitaries. How very conflicting, and the mayor's recollection confirms that Hather was with them for part of the interval, but can't account for his whereabouts during the entire period. There was quite a lot of moving about, people going for refreshments and so forth." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The inspector's newfound diligence was encouraging, though she suspected there were still important discoveries to be made. As they stood conversing, her attention was drawn to the pavilion's decorative lighting, which looked rather less festive in the harsh morning light than it had during the previous evening's performance. The electric lanterns hung in graceful swags across the stage area, their glass panels designed to cast a romantic glow over the proceedings. It was while admiring their craftsmanship that Miss Marple noticed something odd about one particular fixture positioned directly above where Maestro Montini had conducted. "Inspector," she said carefully, "I wonder if you might have someone examine those decorative lanterns more closely. There appears to be something rather unusual about one of them." Inspector Slack followed her gaze upward, squinting against the morning sun. "They look perfectly ordinary to me. What exactly am I supposed to be seeing?" "The third lantern from the left," Miss Marple indicated with her walking stick. "Unless I'm much mistaken, it appears to be missing its light bulb." The inspector studied the fixture more carefully, and Miss Marple was gratified to see his expression sharpen with interest. The lantern in question was indeed dark, its glass panels revealing an empty socket where a bulb should have been. "Sergeant Lake," Inspector Slack called to his subordinate, who was examining something near the water's edge. "Bring that ladder from the storage shed, will you? We need to have a closer look at these lights." While they waited for the sergeant to return with the necessary equipment, Miss Marple continued her examination of the pavilion's overhead fixtures. The missing bulb was particularly intriguing because it was positioned directly above the conductor's podium, where it would have provided focused illumination for the sheet music and conductor's movements. "I don't suppose Miss Pye mentioned removing any bulbs for maintenance?" she inquired mildly. "As a matter of fact, I asked her about that very thing this morning," Inspector Slack replied. "She was quite definite that all the lighting was checked and confirmed working just before the performance began. Claimed she removed no bulbs at all." Sergeant Lake arrived with a stepladder, which he positioned carefully beneath the suspect lantern. As he climbed up to examine the fixture more closely, Miss Marple found herself holding her breath with anticipation. "Empty socket, sir," the sergeant called down. "Looks like the bulb's been removed quite recently. The threads are still bright. not tarnished like they would be if it had been empty for any length of time. "Any sign of the missing bulb nearby?" Inspector Slack asked. Sergeant Lake made a careful survey of the immediate area, checking the stage floor and the spaces between the planking. "Nothing up here, sir, though if it fell, it might have gone right through to the ground below." Miss Marple watched with interest as the sergeant descended and began a systematic search of the area beneath the pavilion. The structure's open construction meant that anything dropped from the stage level would fall directly to the sand and shingle below, though the network of supporting piles would make retrieval rather challenging. It was some 20 minutes later that Sergeant Lake emerged from beneath the pavilion, his uniform rather the worst for wear, but his expression triumphant. In his carefully cupped hands, he carried the fragments of what had once been an electric light bulb. "Found it wedged between two of the support piles," he announced, "smashed to pieces. But there's something rather odd about it." Inspector Slack and Miss Marple gathered round as the sergeant carefully laid out the broken pieces on a clean handkerchief. The glass fragments were indeed puzzling. Instead of the simple internal filament one would expect, there appeared to be additional wiring twisted among the debris. "That's not a standard light bulb," Inspector Slack observed with growing interest. "Someone's been tampering with it." Miss Marple studied the fragments through her magnifying glass, noting the green corrosion on some of the exposed wire ends. "The metal appears to show signs of saltwater exposure," she observed quietly. Saltwater. The inspector leaned closer. But how would a light bulb come into contact with salt water? It was Sergeant Lake who provided the answer, pointing toward the tide line visible beyond the pavilion supports. "High tide comes right up under the structure, sir. If someone had rigged this bulb to hang down on a wire, it would be submerged twice daily." Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill of recognition as the pieces began to fall into place. "Inspector, might I suggest that you have Miss Pym examine these wire fragments? I have a feeling she may be able to tell us exactly what purpose they were intended to serve." Inspector Slack was already wrapping the evidence carefully in his handkerchief. "My thoughts exactly. Though I must say, this business is becoming considerably more complex than I initially supposed it." "Murder often is, Inspector," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I think you'll find that the complexity serves a purpose, to conceal what is actually a rather straightforward crime." As they made their way back toward the main boardwalk, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on this latest discovery. The missing light bulb, obviously modified with additional wiring and showing signs of saltwater exposure, suggested a level of technical sophistication that pointed toward someone with considerable electrical knowledge. The question now was whether Inspector Slack would prove equal to unraveling the full scope of the conspiracy, or whether Miss Marple would need to provide additional gentle guidance to ensure that justice was properly served. Chapter 7. Midnight Tides Beneath the Pile Legs. The discovery of the tampered light bulb had galvanized Inspector Slack into something approaching genuine detective work, much to Miss Marple's quiet satisfaction. By evening, he had established a watch on the pavilion, convinced that whoever had been conducting unauthorized electrical modifications might return to complete their work or remove evidence of their activities. Miss Marple had volunteered to assist in this surveillance, though she suspected the inspector's agreement had more to do with his recognition of her observational skills than any belief in her physical capability for nocturnal detective work. She had positioned herself in the small shelter at the end of the pier, wrapped warmly in her traveling coat, and armed with a thermos of tea and her knitting. The tide was coming in, and she could hear the gentle lap of waves against the pavilion's wooden supports, growing gradually stronger as the water level rose. The moon was nearly full, casting silver paths across the water and providing sufficient illumination to observe any movement around the structure. It was approaching midnight when Miss Marple first detected activity beneath the pavilion. A faint scraping sound, barely audible above the wash of the waves, suggested someone was moving carefully among the support piles. She set aside her knitting and peered intently into the shadows, her hand reaching for the police whistle Inspector Slack had provided. The figure that emerged partially into the moonlight was unmistakably Elsa Pym, though the stage electrician was barely recognizable in her current state. She was soaked to the waist and covered in sand and seaweed, her usually neat appearance disheveled from crawling through the confined space beneath the pavilion. In her hands, she carried what appeared to be a coil of electrical wire and a small tool kit. Miss Marple watched with fascination as Elsa worked with practiced efficiency to splice new wire into what must be the earthing system she had mentioned earlier. Even in the uncertain moonlight, it was clear that this was not routine maintenance, but rather a carefully planned modification to the pavilion's electrical infrastructure. Rather than immediately summoning assistance, Miss Marple decided to observe the proceedings more closely. There was something about Elsa's movements that suggested urgency rather than routine work, and she suspected that interrupting too early might prevent her from understanding the full scope of the electrical modifications. It was at this moment that Sergeant Lake appeared from his concealed position near the shore, having apparently reached the same conclusion about the need for direct observation. Miss Marple watched with some concern as the sergeant began to make his way carefully beneath the pavilion, clearly intent on apprehending Elsa in the act of whatever she was doing. The confined space beneath the structure made stealth nearly impossible, and Elsa became aware of the sergeant's approach before he could get close enough to detain her. She looked up from her work with obvious alarm, her weathered face pale in the moonlight. "Stay where you are, miss," Sergeant Lake called out firmly. "Police, I need to ask you some questions about what you're doing here." To Miss Marple's surprise, Elsa made no attempt to flee. Instead, she straightened up as much as the low clearance would allow and faced the sergeant with apparent resignation. "I suppose it was bound to happen eventually," she said quietly, "though I had hoped to finish the repairs before anyone noticed." "Repairs?" Sergeant Lake moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the fresh wire splices and electrical connections. "What sort of repairs require you to be crawling about under here at midnight?" "Emergency earthing modifications," Elsa replied, gesturing toward the complex array of wiring she had been working on. "Mr. Drummond specifically ordered them after we had that electrical fault during rehearsal yesterday afternoon. Someone could have been seriously hurt if the grounding system had failed completely." Miss Marple frowned at this explanation. She distinctly recalled that yesterday's rehearsal had proceeded without incident, and there had been no mention of any electrical problems until after Maestro Montini's death. Moreover, Elsa's current work appeared far more extensive than any simple repair would require. Sergeant Lake was evidently thinking along similar lines. Mr. Drummond ordered these modifications. When exactly did this conversation take place? Elsa hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between the sergeant and the complex wiring surrounding them. Earlier this evening, he was very concerned about safety, especially after what happened to the poor maestro. "I see. And these modifications required you to work during high tide in the middle of the night, without informing the local authorities." "The work couldn't wait," Elsa insisted, though her voice carried less conviction than before. "The next high tide might have caused a complete system failure. I couldn't risk anyone else being electrocuted." From her vantage point on the pier, Miss Marple could see that Sergeant Lake was not entirely convinced by this explanation. Moreover, she had noticed something that cast further doubt on Elsa's story. Among the tools scattered around the electrician's working area was the missing light bulb from the decorative lantern, or rather what remained of it after being carefully reconstructed from its broken fragments. "Miss Pym," Sergeant Lake said carefully, "I'm going to have to ask you to accompany me to the station. There are some questions about your recent electrical work that need to be answered in rather more detail." Elsa's shoulders sagged with what appeared to be defeat. "I suppose there's no point in pretending anymore," she said wearily, "though I want you to know that I never intended for anyone to be seriously hurt." This admission sent a chill through Miss Marple, confirming her growing suspicions about the true nature of Maestro Montini's death. She watched as Sergeant Lake carefully collected Elsa's tools and equipment, noting particularly his attention to a small container that appeared to contain sea-ater mixed with metal filings. "What's this for?" the sergeant asked, holding up the container. "Aryl solution," Elsa replied reluctantly, "for testing electrical conductivity under saltwater conditions." As the sergeant escorted his prisoner from beneath the pavilion, Miss Marple made her own careful way down from the pier to meet them. The electrician's appearance in the full moonlight was even more revealing than it had been in shadow. Her clothes were not merely wet, but showed clear evidence of prolonged exposure to the coal slag sand that lay beneath the pavilion supports. "Miss Pym," Miss Marple said gently, "might I ask whether your tool bag still contains the light bulb that was removed from the decorative lantern?" Elsa stared at her with obvious surprise, then slowly reached into her toolkit and withdrew the reconstructed bulb. Even in the uncertain light, it was clear that considerable effort had been expended in reassembling the broken pieces, though the additional wiring remained visible. "How did you know?" Elsa asked quietly. "The smell," Miss Marple replied simply. "Hot salt water has a very distinctive odor, and your tools still carry traces of it. I suspect this bulb was submerged in seawater while connected to the pavilion's electrical system, creating the very electrolyte solution you've been working with tonight." Sergeant Lake examined the reconstructed bulb with obvious interest. "Are you saying this was used to conduct electricity through seawater?" "I believe so," Miss Marple confirmed, "though I suspect the full explanation of how and why will require considerably more investigation." As they made their way back toward the main boardwalk, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. Elsa Pym's midnight activities had confirmed many of her suspicions about the technical complexity of Maestro Montini's murder, but they had also raised new questions about the electrician's motives and the extent of any conspiracy. The tide was now at its highest point, lapping against the pavilion's supports and covering the area where Elsa had been working. By morning, any remaining evidence of her activities would be washed clean by the retreating waters, leaving only the testimony of those who had witnessed her nocturnal repairs to the pavilion's deadly electrical system. Chapter 8. The Program Note in Invisible Ink. The morning following Elsa Pym's arrest brought a flurry of activity to the normally quiet seaside town. News of the electrician's detention had spread quickly through the local community, generating considerable speculation about the true circumstances surrounding Maestro Montini's death. Miss Marple, however, found herself troubled by certain aspects of the case that remained unexplained. She was taking her customary morning tea in the inn's small parlor when Mrs. Bantry appeared, looking somewhat flustered and carrying what appeared to be the previous evening's concert program. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing has happened," her friend announced, settling into the chair opposite with obvious agitation. "I was just tidying my things when I noticed something quite peculiar about this program." Miss Marple sat down her teacup, with interest indeed. "What sort of peculiarity?" "Well, I'd spilled a bit of tea on it yesterday evening during the interval, and this morning I thought I might try to steam out the stain." Mrs. Bantry held up the program, which showed clear signs of having been subjected to considerable moisture. But when I held it over the kettle, the most remarkable thing appeared. Miss Marple took the program and examined it carefully. The paper was of good quality, with a glossy finish that had preserved the printing admirably, despite its damp treatment. At first glance, it appeared entirely normal. A tasteful design featuring the evening's musical selections and brief biographical notes about the performers. "I'm afraid I don't see anything unusual, dear," Miss Marple admitted, adjusting her spectacles for a closer look. "Look here on the back page," Mrs. Bantry said eagerly, pointing to what had initially appeared to be blank space beneath the printed acknowledgments. "Hold it up to the light." Miss Marple did as suggested, and immediately understood her friend's excitement. Faint, but clearly visible against the light, were words that had not been apparent under normal viewing conditions. The writing appeared to have been done with some sort of invisible ink that had been revealed by the steam treatment. "How very intriguing," she murmured, reading the revealed text with growing interest. "This appears to be some sort of message." The words written in what looked like fountain pen ink were brief, but clearly threatening in nature. "First interval by my option, or the maestro won't finish the concert." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward anxiously. "Do you think it's connected to poor Maestro Montini's death?" "I should think it very likely," Miss Marple replied, studying the handwriting with considerable attention. The script was flamboyant and confident with elaborate flourishes that suggested someone accustomed to signing documents with a certain theatrical flair. But who could have written such a thing? And why use invisible ink? Miss Marple considered these questions while continuing to examine the program. The use of invisible ink suggested premeditation. Someone had planned to deliver this threat in a way that would not be immediately detected. Moreover, the reference to my option implied a business transaction of some sort. "I believe," she said carefully, "that we should show this to Inspector Slack immediately. But first, I should like to compare this handwriting with some samples I observed yesterday." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. "What sort of samples?" "Various gentlemen signed the visitor's book at the pavilion before the performance," Miss Marple explained. "I noticed several signatures while we were waiting for the concert to begin. One in particular struck me as rather distinctive. They made their way to the pavilion, where the visitor's book still lay open on its stand near the entrance. Miss Marple turned back through the pages until she found the entries from the evening of the concert. There, halfway down the page, was the signature she remembered. Giles Hathery, written in the same elaborate theatrical script that had appeared on the program. "Good heavens," Mrs. Bantry breathed, comparing the two samples. "They're identical, aren't they?" "Very nearly so," Miss Marple confirmed, "though I think we should allow Inspector Slack to make the official determination." They found the inspector in the local police station looking rather more harried than usual as he attempted to process Elsa Pym's arrest while dealing with the increased attention the case was receiving from his superiors. His expression brightened noticeably when Miss Marple presented the program and explained its significance. "Invisible ink, you say?" He examined the revealed message with obvious interest. "Clever way to make a threat without leaving obvious evidence, though not quite clever enough, as it turns out. The handwriting appears to match Mr. Hather's signature in the visitor's book," Miss Marple observed mildly. Inspector Slack studied both samples carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Indeed, it does. This puts rather a different complexion on things, doesn't it? It certainly suggests that Mr. Hathley's interest in the pavilion was rather more urgent than he initially indicated." Miss Marple agreed. "Though I confess I'm puzzled by the timing. This message refers to something that should happen during the first interval. Yet Maestro Montini died during the second half of the performance." The inspector frowned as he considered this apparent discrepancy. Perhaps the plan went wrong somehow? Or maybe Hatha decided to escalate when his initial threat didn't produce the desired result. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. though she suspected the explanation might be more complex than the inspector supposed. The invisible ink message suggested careful planning, but its timing seemed oddly inconsistent with the actual events of the evening. "Have you had an opportunity to question Miss Pym about her relationship with Mr. Hatherley?" she inquired. "As a matter of fact, I have," Inspector Slack replied. "Most interesting conversation that was. Seems Hatherley approached her several weeks ago with what he called a business proposition. Offered her a substantial sum to ensure that the pavilion's electrical systems would suffer some sort of failure during the opening performance, and she agreed. She claimed she initially refused, said she had too much professional pride to sabotage her own work. But Hather was apparently quite persistent, and the money he was offering was more than she could earn in 2 years of honest employment. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. So the original plan was merely to create an electrical failure that would disrupt the performance and perhaps discredit Mr. Drummond's management. That's what she says. But she also admits that her resentment of Drummond's decision to hire foreign musicians instead of local talent made her more receptive to Hather's suggestions than she might otherwise have been. And when did the plan change from mere sabotage to murder? Inspector Slack's expression grew grave. According to Miss Pye, that wasn't supposed to happen at all. She claimed she only intended to create a minor electrical fault that would frighten Montanet and perhaps cause him to refuse to complete the performance. But when she discovered that Hatherley had modified her work to connect the system to live mains current instead of the low-voltage supply she had planned to use, she realized the consequences would be far more serious. Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of seeing the pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to fall into place. So Mr. Hather used Miss Pym's technical expertise to create the basic framework for his plan, then modified it without her knowledge to ensure a fatal outcome. That appears to be the case, though Miss Pym admits she should have realized what was happening when she discovered the unauthorized changes to the wiring. As they prepared to leave the police station, Miss Marple reflected on the implications of these revelations. The invisible ink message on the program confirmed Hatherley's direct involvement in the plot, while Elsa Pym's confession revealed the tragic escalation from simple sabotage to deliberate murder. Yet, she sensed that important questions remained unanswered, particularly regarding the specific mechanism by which Maestro Montini had been electrocuted, and the role played by the various pieces of evidence they had discovered over the past few days. Chapter 9. A Conductor's Baton Filled with Salt Water. The revelations about Giles Hatherley's involvement had cast the investigation in an entirely new light, but Miss Marple found herself still puzzled by the precise mechanism of Maestro Montini's death. While the conspiracy between Hatherley and Elsa Pym was now clear, the actual method by which the conductor had been electrocuted remained tantalizingly elusive. It was while Inspector Slack was preparing to arrest Hatherley that Miss Marple requested permission to examine the conductor's personal effects, which had been carefully stored as evidence. The inspector, now considerably more receptive to her suggestions, readily agreed to this unusual request. "I'm particularly interested in examining the maestro's baton," she explained, as they made their way to the evidence room. "It struck me as odd that such a valuable item should simply be left lying on the stage floor." Inspector Slack retrieved a manila envelope from the evidence locker and carefully emptied its contents onto the examination table. Maestro Montini's personal effects were few but telling. His gold pocket watch, a pair of reading spectacles, several sheets of annotated sheet music, and the silver conductor's baton that had been his most prized possession. Miss Marple lifted the baton carefully, surprised by its weight. The silver shaft gleamed under the harsh electric light, its surface bearing the intricate engravings that marked it as a presentation piece of considerable value. What immediately caught her attention, however, was a small detail that had apparently escaped previous notice. "Inspector," she said quietly, "observe the end cap of the baton. Does anything strike you as unusual?" Inspector Slack leaned closer, studying the ornate silver final that topped the conductor's implement. "It looks perfectly normal to me. Rather fancy work, actually." "Indeed, it is. But notice how the threading appears fresh and bright, as though it had been unscrewed quite recently." Miss Marple held the baton up to the light, examining the joint between the main shaft and the decorative end piece. The metal threads showed clear signs of recent disturbance, with tiny scratches that suggested the cap had been removed and replaced within the past few days. "Are you suggesting someone tampered with the maestro's baton?" Inspector Slack asked with growing interest. "I think we should determine whether this end cap is meant to be removable," Miss Marple replied diplomatically. "Such batons are sometimes hollow, used to store rosin or other small items a conductor might need during performance." With careful manipulation, she found that the end cap did indeed unscrew, revealing that the baton was hollow throughout its length. But what emerged when she inverted the implement was far more significant than rosin or spare buttons. A thin stream of liquid poured from the hollow interior. Liquid that had the unmistakable cloudy appearance and sharp odor of seawater. Moreover, suspended within this improvised reservoir were tiny metallic particles that caught the light like glitter. "Good heavens!" Inspector Slack breathed, staring at the evidence with obvious amazement. Someone filled the conductor's baton with seater and metal filings. Miss Marple nodded gravely. The perfect electrolyte solution, readily available to anyone working near a seaside location. When combined with the electrical modifications Miss Pym had made to the microphone system, it would create a deadly pathway for electrical current. The inspector was beginning to understand the full implications of this discovery. So when Montini raised his baton and brought it down to begin the music, he was actually completing an electrical circuit between the faulty microphone and the metal music stand. Precisely. The salt water and copper filings inside the baton would have conducted electricity far more efficiently than his body alone. The current would have passed through the baton, through his hands and arms, and down to the metal stand he was touching with his other hand. Inspector Slack examined the empty baton more closely, noting the fine scratches around the end cap that confirmed it had been recently opened and refilled. But how did the sea water get inside? Surely Montini would have noticed if his baton felt different. Miss Marple considered this question carefully. "I suspect the modification was made during the interval when the maestro would have set his baton aside while the orchestra rested. It would have taken only a few moments to unscrew the cap, add the electrolyte solution, and replace it. And who would have had access to do such a thing? Anyone with access to the stage area during the interval, though it would require someone with sufficient knowledge of electrical conductivity to understand the significance of creating such a solution. The implications of this discovery were profound. The baton filled with electrolyte solution explained not only how Maestro Montini had been electrocuted, but also why the initial assumption of natural death had seemed so plausible. To casual observation, he had simply collapsed while conducting with no obvious external cause. "The brilliance of the method," Miss Marple observed quietly, "lies in its apparent impossibility. Who would suspect that a conductor's own baton had been turned into a deadly conductor of electricity?" Inspector Slack was already making notes for his report. "This explains the burn marks on Montini's shoes that you noticed, and the ozone smell around his body. When the electrical current passed through him, it would have sought the most direct path to ground through his feet, to the metal framework of the stage. Indeed, and the splash of brine that Elsa mentioned finding on the microphone's windscreen would have occurred when the electrical arc first formed. The sudden heating of the saltwater solution would have caused it to expand violently, forcing some of the liquid out through the baton's opening. As they carefully repackaged the evidence, Miss Marple reflected on the cold-blooded calculation required for such a murder. The killer had not only needed to understand the electrical modifications Elsa had made to the sound system, but had also required intimate knowledge of Maestro Montini's conducting habits and access to his personal equipment. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe you'll find that Mr. Hather's background includes more than just concert promotion. A man who could devise such an elaborate electrical murder would need considerable technical knowledge." "I'll have Sergeant Lake look into his background immediately," Inspector Slack replied. "Though I must say, Miss Marple, without your observations about the baton, we might never have understood how the murder was actually accomplished." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles modestly. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, Inspector, provided one pays attention to the details that others might overlook. In this case, the very instrument of Maestro Montini's artistry became the instrument of his destruction." As they prepared to leave the evidence room, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the tragic irony of the conductor's death. The silver baton that had helped him create beautiful music had been perverted into a tool of murder. Its hollow interior turned into a reservoir of death, disguised as an object of artistic expression. The case was rapidly approaching its conclusion, but she sensed that one final revelation awaited. The complete exposure of the conspiracy that had transformed a simple business dispute into a carefully orchestrated murder. Chapter 10. Truth echoes with the dawn rehearsal. The arrest of Giles Hathili had been accomplished without drama. The concert agent submitting to Inspector Slack's authority with the resignation of a man who knew his elaborate scheme had finally unraveled. By the following morning, both conspirators were in custody, and Miss Marple found herself invited to witness the inspector's final reconstruction of the crime for the benefit of the local magistrate and other interested parties. The small group assembled on the pavilion included Dr. Haydock, Sergeant Lake, Mr. Drummond, Betty Fawcett, and Mrs. Bantry, all of whom had played roles, however unwitting, in the tragic events of 3 days past. The morning was clear and bright, with a fresh breeze that set the replacement bunting dancing cheerfully above their heads. "Ladies and gentlemen," Inspector Slack began, "his men are considerably more confident than Miss Marple had previously observed. I have asked you here to witness a demonstration of how Maestro Montini met his death, and to ensure that the full truth of this matter is properly understood." He gestured toward a collection of electrical equipment that had been carefully arranged on the stage, including the tampered microphone, samples of the modified wiring, and the conductor's silver baton with its deadly contents. The murder of Carlo Montini was not a crime of passion, but a carefully planned and technically sophisticated operation designed to appear as natural death. It required the collaboration of two individuals, each contributing essential expertise to achieve their common goal of preventing the pavilion's successful reopening. Miss Marple watched with satisfaction as the inspector proceeded to outline the conspiracy with remarkable clarity. His investigation had revealed that Hatha possessed not only concert promotion experience, but also considerable knowledge of electrical systems gained during his wartime service with the Royal Engineers. Mr. Hathli's plan was elegantly simple in concept, Inspector Slack continued. He would use Miss Pym's legitimate access to the pavilion's electrical systems to create a pathway for a lethal current, timing the fatal moment to coincide with the most dramatic portion of the evening's performance. The inspector demonstrated how Ella Pye had been persuaded to create what she believed was a harmless electrical fault in the conductor's microphone. Her modifications had included slitting the rubber shield, and connecting the microphone to an earthing cable that ran beneath the pavilion to a light bulb submerged in the rising tide. Miss Pym genuinely believed she was creating a minor shock that would merely frighten the maestro and disrupt the performance. Inspector Slack explained she had calculated the electrical load based on the pavilion's normal low-voltage systems. But Mr. Hathery had other plans. Miss Marple interjected gently. He secretly modified the wiring to connect directly to the mains electrical supply, ensuring that any shock would prove fatal.